in which our lovers begin to learn the consequences of their actions. Chapter 22. It was past 5 o'clock, and therefore, so as not to be late and at the same time not to take his own horses, which everyone knew, Vronsky took Yashvin's hired cab and ordered the driver to go as fast as he could. The old four-seater coach was roomy. He sat in the corner, stretched his legs out on the front seat, and fell to thinking. The vague awareness of the clarity his affairs had been brought to, the vague recollection of the friendship and flattery of Serpukhowskoy, who considered him a necessary man, and, above all, the anticipation of the meeting, all united into one general, joyful feeling of life. This feeling was so strong that he smiled involuntarily. He put his feet down, placed one leg across the knee of the other, and, taking it in his hand, felt the resilient calf, hurt the day before in his fall, and leaning back, took several deep breaths. Good, very good, he said to himself. Before, too, he had often experienced the joyful awareness of his body, but never had he so loved himself, his own body, as now. He enjoyed feeling that slight pain in his strong leg, enjoyed feeling the movement of his chest muscles as he breathed. That same clear and cold August day, which had had such a hopeless effect on Anna, to him seemed stirringly invigorating, and refreshed his face and neck that tingled from the dowsing. The smell of brilliantine on his mustache seemed especially enjoyable to him in that fresh air. Everything he saw through the coach window, everything in that cold, clean air and that pale light of sunset, was as fresh, cheerful, and strong as himself. The rooftops glistening in the rays of the sinking sun, the sharp outlines of fences and the corners of buildings, the figures of the rare passers-by and the carriages they met, the motionless green of the trees and grass, the fields with regularly incised rows of potatoes, the slanting shadows cast by the houses, trees, and bushes, and the rows of potatoes themselves. Everything was as beautiful as a pretty landscape just finished and coated with varnish. Faster, faster, he said to the cabby. Leaning out the window, he took a 3-ruble bill from his pocket and handed it to the driver as he turned. The cabby's hand felt for something by the lantern. The whip whistled, and the carriage rolled quickly along the smooth road. I need nothing but this happiness, he thought, gazing at the ivory knob of the bell between the windows, and imagining Anna as he had seen her the last time. And the further it goes, the more I love her. Here's the garden of Raid's government country house. Where is she? Where? How? Why did she arrange the meeting here and write it in Betsy's letter? He wondered only now, but there was no more time for thinking. He stopped the coach before it reached the avenue, opened the door, jumped out while the carriage was still moving, and walked into the avenue leading to the house. There was no one in the avenue, but looking to the right, he saw her. Her face was covered with a veil, but with joyful eyes he took in the special motion of her gait, peculiar to her alone, the curve of her shoulders and the poise of her head, and immediately it was as if an electric current ran through his body. He felt his own self with new force, from the resilient movements of his legs to the movements of his lungs as he breathed, and something tickled his lips. Coming up to him, she pressed his hand firmly. "You're not angry that I sent for you. It was necessary for me to see you," she said, and the serious and stern set of her lips, which he could see behind the veil, immediately changed his state of mind. "I? Angry? But how did you come? Why here?" "Never mind," she said, putting her hand on his. "Come, we must talk." He understood that something had happened, that this meeting would not be joyful. In her presence he had no will of his own. Not knowing the reason for her anxiety, he already felt that the same anxiety had involuntarily communicated itself to him. "What is it? What?" he asked, pressing her arm with his elbow and trying to read her thoughts in her face. She walked a few steps in silence, gathering her courage, and suddenly stopped. "I didn't tell you yesterday," she began, breathing rapidly and heavily, "that on the way home with Alexei Alexandrovitch, I told him everything. I said that I could not be his wife, that I told him everything." He listened to her, involuntarily leaning his whole body towards her, as if wishing in this way to soften the difficulty of her situation. But as soon as she had said it, he suddenly straightened up, and his face acquired a proud and stern expression. Yes, it's better. 1,000 times better. I understand how difficult it was," he said. But she was not listening to his words. She was reading his thoughts in the expression of his face. She could not have known that his expression reflected the first thought that occurred to him, that a duel was now inevitable. The thought of a duel had never entered her head, and therefore she explained this momentary expression of sternness differently. Having received her husband's letter, she already knew in the depths of her soul that everything would remain as before, that she would be unable to scorn her position, to leave her son and unite herself with her lover. The morning spent at Princess Tverskoy's had confirmed her still more in that, but all the same this meeting was extremely important for her. She hoped it would change their situation and save her. If at this news he should say to her resolutely, passionately, without a moment's hesitation, "Abandon everything and fly away with me," she would leave her son and go with him. But the news did not produce in him what she expected. He only seemed insulted by something. "It wasn't the least bit difficult. It got done by itself," she said irritably. "Here." She took her husband's letter from her glove. I understand, he interrupted, taking the letter without reading it and trying to calm her. "I wished for one thing. I asked for one thing, to break up this situation in order to devote my life to your happiness." "Why are you telling me that?" she said. "Could I possibly doubt it? If I did..." "Who's that coming?" Vronsky said suddenly, pointing at 2 ladies coming towards them. "Maybe they know us." And he hastened to turn down a sidewalk, drawing her after him. "Oh, I don't care," she said. Her lips were trembling, and it seemed to him that her eyes looked at him with a strange spite from behind her veil. "As I said, that's not the point. I cannot doubt that. But here's what he writes to me. Read it." She stopped again. Again, as in the first moment, at the news of her break with her husband, Vronsky, while reading the letter, involuntarily yielded to the natural impression aroused in him by his attitude towards the insulted husband. Now, as he held his letter in his hands, he involuntarily pictured to himself the challenge he would probably find today or tomorrow at his place, and the duel itself, during which he would stand with the same cold and proud expression that was now on his face having fired into the air, awaiting the insulted husband's shot. And at once there flashed in his head the thought of what Serpukhowskoy had just said to him, and what he himself had thought that morning, that it was better not to bind himself, and he knew that he could not tell her this thought. Having read the letter, he raised his eyes to her, and there was no firmness in his look. She understood at once that he had already thought it over to himself. She knew that whatever he might tell her, he would not say everything he thought, and she understood that her last hope had been disappointed. This was not what she had expected. "You see what sort of man he is," she said in a trembling voice. "He—" "Forgive me, but I'm glad of it," Vronsky interrupted. "For God's sake, let me finish," he added, his eyes begging her to give him time to explain his words. "I'm glad because it simply cannot remain as he suggests." "Why not?" Anna asked, holding back her tears, obviously no longer attaching any significance to what he was going to say. She felt that her fate was decided. Vronsky wanted to say that after the duel, in his opinion, inevitable, this could not go on, but he said something else. "It cannot go on. I hope you will leave him now. I hope," he became confused and blushed, "that you will allow me to arrange and think over our life. Tomorrow," he began. She did not let him finish. "And my son," she cried out. "Do you see what he writes? I must leave him, and I cannot and will not do it." "But for God's sake, which is better, to leave your son or to go on in this humiliating situation?" "Humiliating for whom?" "For everyone, and most of all for you." "You say humiliating. Don't say it. Such words have no meaning for me," she said in a trembling voice. She did not want him to say what was not true now. All she had left was his love, and she wanted to love him. "You understand that from the day I loved you, everything has changed for me. For me there is one thing only, your love. If it is mine, I feel myself so high, so firm, that nothing can be humiliating for me. I'm proud of my position because proud. And she did not finish saying what she was proud of. Tears of shame and despair stifled her voice. She stopped and burst into sobs. He also felt something rising in his throat, tickling in his nose, and for the first time in his life he felt himself ready to cry. He could not have said precisely what moved him so. He pitied her, and he felt that he could not help her, and at the same time he knew that he was to blame for her unhappiness, that he had done something bad. "Is divorce impossible?" he said weakly. She shook her head without replying. "Can't you take your son and leave him anyway?" "Yes, but it all depends on him. And now I must go to him," she said dryly. Her feeling that everything would remain as before had not deceived her. "I'll be in Petersburg on Tuesday, and everything will be decided." "Yes," she said, "but let's not talk about it any more." Anna's carriage, which she had sent away and told to come to the gate of Verd's garden, drove up. She took leave of him and went home. If you enjoy this format, please leave a like and subscribe and return tomorrow for the next chapter.